And now I'd like to call up Jacob Schwab to start our presentation.
Good morning. My name is Jacob Schwab, and I am proud to be a third-generation member of the Aquinas family. Today, it is my distinct honor to introduce our distinguished guests, Major Holleder's daughter, Katie Holleder Fellow, and her husband, Dan, Major Holleder's Aquinas classmates and teammates, and Senator Joseph Robach, Aquinas class of 1976. I would now like to introduce Mr. Jay Polston, Aquinas class of 1990. Thank you.
Good morning. Today we're here to remember and honor one of our alumni, and there's going to be people up here that can speak much better than I can in terms of his history and his character. But before we do that, I'd like to first invite Don's daughter, Katie Fellows, and his football teammate, Joe Miller, up to the stage. We're going to take a minute, please. We're going to take a minute to watch some clips from a movie called When Duty Calls. It was made by Don's classmates at West Point to honor him. The full movie you can see on the Aquinas YouTube channel, but we're going to see a little bit to kind of give you an idea of why we're honoring him today.
Sacrificed his life to save other men, and that's what Major Holleder did that terrible, terrible day in October 1967.
Drafted by the New York Giants, Holly could have become a professional football player after serving 3 years in the Army. But he chose to make the United States Army his career. By the time Holleder arrived in Vietnam, he had attained the rank of major, was 32 years old, and had been an officer for 11 years. His career path had been outstanding. He had held the kind of jobs, served in the key positions, and graduated from the professional military schools that made his future look very bright. As the operations officer of a combat infantry brigade, Holleder spent many of his 18-hour days flying in a helicopter checking on the troops. On the 17th of September, 1967, he observed that a tank had been blown up by an enemy mine. Ordering his helicopter to land, Holleder raced to the tank, climbed to the turret, rescued the crew, and extinguished the fire. Because of this, he received the Soldier's Medal for this act of heroism. 1 month later, this act of courage would be repeated.
The 1st platoon elements found a well-used trail, and the battalion commander ordered them to set up a hasty ambush. But what we didn't realize is we were going into the kill zone of ambush waiting for us.
On the 17th of October, the 2nd Battalion of the 28th Infantry was caught in a major ambush. A much larger enemy force had overwhelmed the Americans, and the radios crackled with pleas for help. Holleder was not on the ground, but when he heard the anguished radio calls, he immediately decided to rush to the aid of the embattled troops.
At just about that time, a major came running up with 2 or 3 men with him. Never saw him before. And he said, "Come on, Doc, there's wounded in there. Let's go get him." And he went running ahead of us. We warned him that there was still firing coming in, snipers. And an AK-47 opened up out of the tree line and cut the major down. I close my eyes and I can see a brave sergeant standing up and providing cover fire for me. And I'll never, I don't know if he killed the enemy, but he quieted them down. And I got to the major and just started to put the first bandage on him, and he died. I found out later that that was Major Don Holleder.
As many of you know, we have many successful alumni from our school, but I think you can see why Major Holleder was a little bit special and a little bit different than most. Realizing that at one point, he sat in this auditorium like all of you do, and did activities, played sports, went to class, and it's my honor now to have Joe Miller, class of 1951, one of Don's football teammates, come up and say a few words.
Thank you. I first met Don 68 years ago on the practice fields in back of these buildings. It was B-team tryouts. We were just a bunch of 14 and 15-year-old kids who wanted to become part of the Aquinas legend. Who knew such greatness was on the field that day? Don immediately made it up to the first string. I was one of several guards that rotated in and out, so I really did have the opportunity to play with Don in those early years. 3 members of that squad are in the Aquinas Hall of Fame: Don, Bob Niermeyer, and Bob Hans. What I remember of that season is playing just a few games, going up every week against the varsity to run the opposing team's plays to get them ready for Sunday's game, and Don having an unnerving talent for catching passes. The following football season at Aquinas was one of the best in Aquinas' long, storied history. About 14 of us from the previous year's B team made it up to the varsity. Don and Bob Niermeyer both became starters. Quarterback Jim Burns discovered how talented Don's hands were. I can still remember Jim lofting many a long, arching pass down the field and Don racing with his arms outstretched and catching that ball. It was a beautiful sight to watch. How good was that team? Undefeated, untied, and ranked number 1 in the nation, ahead of Massillon, Ohio, who had traditionally had that ranking. Don moved on to West Point after he graduated from Aquinas in 1952. He progressed rapidly in his first 2 years at West Point under the tutelage of legendary Vince Lombardi, who was the backfield and ends coach. In his junior year, Don played in 7 games, caught 17 passes for 495 yards, 5 for touchdowns, and an average of 29 yards. Needless to say, he was on everybody's All-American that year. The next year, Don's senior year, Army had a problem. Pete Van, who had been quarterback, wasn't eligible to play. Coach Earl Red Blake didn't feel that he had a strong enough quarterback to play the position, so he decided to go a different route. He chose a leader. He chose Don Holleder. The sports world thought that Blake was crazy and coined the phrase Blake's Folly. What did Don do? He led Army to a 6-3 season, including a climatic win at the end of the season against Navy, a heavily favored Navy. Navy sort of took the game in the first half. Something happened at halftime, and somehow Don willed the Army team to come back and on the ground, run across Navy left and right, and finally win that game 14-6. Don, who had been an All-American the year before, didn't make All-American that year. But the Navy quarterback, George Welsh, who was the leading passer that year, was an All-American, and Don bested him on that day. A few weeks later, Don got a call from Vince Lombardi at the polo fields. Vince was the offensive coach for the New York Giants. And he told Don that the Giants were going to draft him and wait the 3 years for his Army commitment to be over. Of course, Don had a different plan. He was going to make the Army his career. Unfortunately, that ended sooner than he thought. You've all heard the story today of what happened over in Vietnam, so many miles away. But in closing, I want to share 2 letters with you that I brought forth, both written 50 years ago. The first I wrote on October 20th, 3 days after Don's death, to Mrs. Holleder. And I said, along with the condolences that must be pouring in as a whole nation mourns the death of your husband, let me offer my own and my family's. I never had the honor of meeting you, but I knew Don personally. We were in high school together at Aquinas and were football teammates in 1950. How can one say, I am sorry, deeply enough at a time like this? What words could I write that would console you or give you strength during this awesome tragedy that has befallen you and your family? Your husband, as you must know better than any, was a man among men, an athlete among athletes, and a leader who was destined for many great things in this world. Now destiny, at God's will, has made other plans for him. In the Wednesday evening paper, Ralph Hyman, who was sports editor of the Rochester Times-Union, said that Don had the mannerisms of a prince. How true this was. He also compared your tragedy to that of Mrs. John F. Kennedy's. No truer comparison could be made. Like our late president, Don was a dedicated individual. His greatest loves were for his family, his country, his friends, and the sporting world, but mostly football. No greater love could any man have than to pay the supreme sacrifice. Those of us who knew Don only briefly are far richer than we could ever hope to be because of our lives having touched. He stood for all of the highest ideals that most of us can only aspire to. He is an example and a hero for the children of many generations to come, including my own as they grow up. For all of his greatness, Don was a humble individual. He did not allow himself to forget even his casual friends from boyhood. At the recent testimonial dinner for Father Cy Carter in June, I stopped to talk with Don afterwards, just to say hello and introduce a friend and neighbor who happened to come to the dinner with me. I thought that I would perhaps have to remind Don who I was. Don had gone on to meet many people all over the world since his high school days. Besides, the years had caused many changes. In my own case, my hair line had crept back, I wore glasses, but before I could say anything, Don blurted out, "Red Miller, how's everything with you?" I would not have missed Father Carter's dinner for any reason because of my great respect for him, but I will treasure forever the bonus I received that night. I will cherish the memory of that last meeting with Don forever. Mrs. Holleder, my family and I will pray for you and your family that God may give you strength during the days ahead. If it helps, you might think that for Don, the game is not over. He has merely been selected for the greatest All-American team of all. God bless you. A few months later, I received a very lovely note from Mrs. Holleder. She said, "I want you to know that my tardiness in writing is in no way an indication of my very deep appreciation for your thoughtfulness. I am so very grateful to you for enrolling Don in the Franciscan fraternity. I am sincerely honored, as I know Don would be. And I also want you to know how truly touched I have been by your lovely letter. I only wish I knew you personally so that I might express my thanks more adequately. Perhaps one day I will have the opportunity to meet you. Till then, please accept my deepest appreciation. Sincerely, Carolyn Holleder. Unfortunately, she died unexpectedly in 2005, but I am honored to meet one of her daughters here tonight. Thank you.
I think you'll see, and you know that how close our classmates, not are close just here, but after Aquinas as well, similar to family. And on that day, 50 years ago, Don didn't just make the ultimate sacrifice, but his family did as well. And we're very honored and blessed to have one of his daughters here today to speak to us, Katie Holleder Fellows.
Good morning. So that's a tough act to follow, and you pretty much wrote my speech for me, so thank you for doing that. It is a great pleasure to be here with you all today. I look out in this audience and I see these young faces, and I think about your future ahead of you. I think about the lessons you have to learn. I think about all of the things you have to accomplish, and I just want you to know that I pray for you. I wish the very best for you. Like I said, I'm so pleased to be here to honor and celebrate my father, Don Holleder. I would be very remiss if I didn't thank the many people that made this ceremony today possible. Jim Lanson, I'm not sure where you are, but thank you. I know the tireless energy that went into planning and conducting today. Jay, thank you for everything, the many emails, making sure that we got here on time and where we were supposed to be in all of the alumni office and administration. As I've said, I am the second daughter of Don Holleder, and I am moved that here we are 50 years later after my father's death, and we're still coming together to honor him. His is a legacy of self-sacrifice, courage, valor, honor, and above all else, team before self. My father was born on August 3rd, 1934 in Buffalo, New York. At the age of 12, he and his parents moved to Rochester. His cousins would tell you, even as a little kid, he was large and in charge. Although his character traits were innate, it was during his years at Aquinas that his ideals of honor, respect, courage were honed. He was a three-sport athlete, and while he was a star at basketball and baseball, it was football that allowed him to test his strength and endurance. He was a big guy, and he liked the physical contact. Recently, I learned that my father was offered 81 full scholarships to play football coming out of Aquinas. That's a lot. But he chose West Point. He was recruited by Vince Lombardi, who was an assistant coach at the time to Earl Blake. And in 1952, the Army football team was a national powerhouse. My dad was a two-sport athlete at West Point, but it was football again where he found his success. In his junior year, as you've heard, he was awarded an All-American honors. His size, strength, athleticism, and most importantly, his dedication served him well. In the beginning of his senior year, Coach Blake asked him to move to the quarterback position, one he had never played. And again, you've heard Blake's folly. Coach Blake needed a leader. He knew he could teach a leader to be quarterback, but he wasn't certain he could teach a quarterback to be a leader. So he needed my father, Don Holleder. He gave up second-year honors, possible honors for All-American, and moved to the quarterback position. It was not the best year in Army's football history, but they did beat Navy, and that's always the top record. My father was again recruited by Vince Lombardi to play for the New York Giants after graduation. He turned this down because he wanted to fulfill his commitment and lifelong dream to become an Army officer. My dad was not built to sit behind a desk. It was the field that he wanted to be, whether it was the football field or the battlefield. So in August of 1967, he left for Vietnam. He left behind my mom, my 3 sisters, his mother and stepfather, and many, many cousins and many, many friends. And on October 17th, 1967, he was killed in action. He ran into a firestorm battle to save his men, his team, from the enemy. For that act of heroism, he was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. So here we are, 50 years later, honoring his legacy, his life, his character, his courage, his honor, his respect, his valor, and above all else, team before self. My father was always true to himself, to his ideals, and all that he did, and ultimately, that is how he died. So again, thank you for this great honor today, and if you young men and women in the audience take anything away from today, remember that strength of character allowed my father to excel at everything he did, and that will serve you well in the future. Thank you.